the general view of guys like me, guys my age and older, is that nobody uses bike lanes, right? That they're really expensive and nobody uses them, and they make life worse for people.
You're going to find that people are still going to be on those roads, whether they're on their bikes or driving. They're not just going to disappear just because the bike lane disappears. Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffat.
And today we're talking about the idea that we can fix traffic by eliminating bike lanes.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
If you're not a regular news follower, you might not know it, but there's a big fight brewing in Toronto over bike lanes. The province introduced legislation that will require municipalities to obtain approval from the province for new bike lanes. And it also removes some bike lanes that are already there, including ones that were just finally finished being constructed. So basically, each municipality has their own approvals process for whether or not a bike lane fits into their communities. So once one's approved there, it would now be passed up to the province for a new secondary assessment of whether it should happen. Now that we've seen the details of the legislation, which includes things like removing environmental assessments for the new highway that Doug Ford wants to build, it also includes that they've already decided that 3 major bike lanes in Toronto, Yonge, University, and part of the Bloor lanes, should all go, even if their staff doesn't recommend it under their new review process.
So this seems motivated by concerns around traffic, particularly in the city of Toronto. And I don't live in the center of the universe, but I hear that traffic isn't great. So, Cara, you do live in Toronto. So is traffic really a top of mind issue in the city?
For sure, a lot of people are really concerned about it. There is actually a ton of congestion, and it's been like that for many years, but it's gotten really, I think there was a dip during the pandemic when a lot of people weren't working or they weren't working in the offices. And so people weren't traveling as much, they weren't commuting as much. And then all of a sudden it picked up again. And in that time, we also had a ton of population growth, or like in places where people would be commuting into Toronto. And so we see people who are actually like really concerned about traffic, that there's actually a ton of congestion. For sure there is. It came up during the municipal election. We had a candidate, Anthony Furey, who basically ran on largely his platform was cutting out bike lanes, and same with Mark Saunders. And there's also been a lot of traffic in lots of the city streets as well as on the highways. Like we look at Eglinton, and like the crosstown closed a lot of Eglinton for a very long time. So that brought more traffic into other areas and made it going really slow for going anywhere along there. And we just see it happening elsewhere, like along where the Ontario line's being built, there's a lot of closures right now. There's just so much construction as well, where they're building any condos. Like it takes up so much of the road space that like traffic really is backed up, especially if you're trying to go in and out of the city or crossing the city. It's very frustrating. I always kind of think that like I'm in the east end of the city and I'm like, well, if it's rush hour, I'm not leaving the east end of the city unless I have to, because like I don't want to go out there in that time. Everything will take so long to get anywhere, especially driving. Off the top of my head, I can think of at least like a half dozen ways we can improve traffic in Toronto. And so I find it a little bit weird that he's landed on this solution when it doesn't seem like this is one that's actually going to solve things. Do you think this is because the premier himself is inconvenienced by bike lanes, especially that Bloor Street one that he's been complaining about that goes into his area?
Well, I'm sure that makes it a top of mind issue for him, but I would say overall no. That I think pretty much the sense I get up here in Ottawa is that folks in Toronto are really upset about traffic. So doing anything visible about traffic, I think would be popular. But I think particularly this solution, I think this resonates with a lot of people and a lot of voters, or at least a lot of people who are more likely to vote. And I'm going to talk about some of the views on bike lanes, and I just want to caveat that these are not my personal views. I'm a guy with a garage full of bikes. I actually own a Danish cargo bike that I use quite a bit, so I am an outlier here. But I'm also a middle-aged white guy, and I can think I can explain how middle-aged white guys think, and later I can tell you how to change the oil filter on your Dodge Ram. But I think the general view of guys like me, guys my age and older, is that nobody uses bike lanes, right? That they're really expensive and nobody uses them, and they make life worse for people. One term I've heard is that they're a form of fiscal virtue signaling that shows that you care about an issue but aren't really doing anything constructive, that you're just kind of shoveling money at a problem, doing so in a way that inconveniences people, in this case that it creates these bike lanes, but doesn't actually make life better for anyone at the end of the day. And again, no, this is not my view, but it is common across my peers and older men. So, speaking of kind of my cohort of men, I want to read a quote from Michael Taube writing in the National Post supporting Doug Ford's actions. And what he says is that bike lanes have always impeded traffic. How could they not? The more bike lanes there are, the less space there are on the roads for cars and trucks to move properly. And while road construction and parking spaces obviously contribute to slower traffic, the focus on cyclists and bike lanes has made a bad situation even worse. So we'll post a link to the piece in the show notes. But Cara, I understand this kind of line of thinking. Again, being a middle-aged white guy, I'd love to get your take on this because I'm guessing you won't agree.
Yeah, I find that take quite baffling, honestly, because, like, despite what he thinks, those cyclists do exist regardless of whether they have dedicated lanes. And that's something that I hear over and over, like, that people think, oh, well, you just get rid of them and traffic will get better because you'll have all these cars that all of a sudden have another lane to use. And I always say to people who hate bike lanes, do you think that traffic would be better or worse if all those people in bike lanes got in cars instead and were on the road with you? And the normal answer I get is, well, those people would just be taking public transit anyways. Like, they're not going to be on the road. They're not drivers. And I don't think that's true. And I've never seen any evidence that suggests that's true. I'm in a group of people who like know I'm in like kind of that age where there's lots of people who ride bikes, especially because I live in an area of the city that's quite bike friendly, and lots of people have cars, myself included. I decide whether to bike or drive depending on what's more convenient for me and depending on where I'm going. I think that some people will drive for sure. I think there will definitely be some people who take transit instead. And there's also going to be some people who choose to continue to bike because that's the fastest way to get places. And if you don't feel safe, the best way to keep yourself safe when you're on the road is take the whole lane, which you're allowed to do. And I think that drivers get really upset when you do that. I've personally been honked at many times before, especially on Young Street before those bike lanes were there, when I'd bike down or up and I would just take the whole lane because I'm like, I don't trust that you guys are going to give me space. I've had lots of experience that proves that people are not going to give me the minimum legal amount of space to make me safe. And so you take the whole lane. And I think that you're going to find that people are still going to be on those roads, whether they're on their bikes or driving. They're not just going to disappear just because the bike lane disappears. And it's just mind-boggling that so many people think that that's the case.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think the same way, that I can understand why people are upset about bike lines. But at the same time, I'm like, do you really want me to be going down the street at 15 kilometers an hour in my cargo bike in front of you? Right. So it's like, if you think I'm slowing you down on the bike lane, just wait until I have to go on the street. So yeah, I absolutely agree. There seems to be this misunderstanding about what the sort of opportunity costs are, or what the alternatives look like, and in many cases the alternatives are worse for drivers.
This notion that I've heard, especially among boomers, that bikes are just for those like downtown left-wing pinkos, if they even exist at all. And I just don't understand why forms of transportation seem to have political leanings in this country. It's like so strange to me because I look at other places in the world outside of Canada and that's not the case. I remember looking at Boris Johnson in the UK, and he was a cyclist and he's definitely a right-wing politician, but he supported major bike lane expansion in the UK. So I got to ask, like, why is it different here? Why is it that cycling is a left-wing activity and driving is a right-wing activity here?
Yeah, well, I think on the Boris Johnson case, I think was actually notable because he was playing against type a little bit. But I do think that there is this belief in kind of Anglo-American countries that is determined by culture and media and so on. So again, I'm playing my Gen X white guy card here, So I'm gonna travel you back in time to the 1980s, when I was growing up, and because I think our childhood experiences, kind of determine, at least somewhat determine our worldviews, and back then, yeah, we saw cycling as, as kind of a leisure activity or sport. This was there where BMX biking was really popular, and people watched the Tour de France and kind of thing like that, but I got to tell you, growing up in kind of blue collar neighborhood, the view was that basically like anybody who biked as an actual form of transportation, who was like an adult male, was either poor or an alcoholic who lost their license because of a DUI. And there was a tweet that came out a decade ago. I was looking for it, I couldn't find it, from one of the regional police forces here in Ontario, and it was basically telling people, hey, don't drink and drive over Christmas, because if you do, you're going to have to bike to work, right? So there are these, there is this view, and it's also in the media, right? There's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer gets has to stop drinking for 30 days, and they show him on his daughter's bicycle, and there's a 40-year-old virgin. You and I were talking about that movie. If you look at how cycling as a form of transportation is viewed in the media, it is often negatively, and I think those those representations affect people's views. Now, I don't think that's the reason necessarily that Ford is ripping these out, right? I think again, it's real concerns about traffic and so on, but it is seen by, if you're a 50 or 55-year-old guy, those are the kind of beliefs that you grew up with, and I think many of us still have.
This is something where like the province is doing something that is kind of in the municipality's jurisdiction. Like I know that really everything's in the province's jurisdiction. Anything you're mad at the city about, really the province has jurisdiction over in the end if they wanted to. And so they have the right to do this. But it looks really weird considering the way that Doug Ford said, I'm not going to force municipalities to upzone or build more homes. Like they know what's best for their communities. So why would I tell them? I trust them. And so he kind of came across to a lot of people looking like a bit of a hypocrite, because it's like, what, you trust them on housing where they've clearly failed, and you don't trust them on local roads, even especially on these roads in particular, which were downloaded to the city back in, I think it was the last time that we had a PC government before Doug Ford, because they said that these are local roads, that the province shouldn't be paying for them, the province shouldn't be maintaining them because they're not of interest to the rest of the province. Why do you think he's willing to kind of open himself up to that label of being a hypocrite over bike lanes?
Yeah, so I don't think the politicians worry that much about being called hypocrites, because I think the general public thinks that all politicians are hypocrites. So calling a politician a hypocrite is like calling water wet. Like it's like, it's just you kind of expect it. But I totally agree. On the one hand, he's saying, well, I'm not gonna, tell municipalities what to do on housing, and then on the other hand, he's gonna start ripping up bike lanes in cities, which is clearly a municipal, in the municipal realm. But I think what you have to understand, the sort of electoral calculus of this is that Ford needs, there will be an election at some point sooner or later,
Probably sooner.
and
Seems like it.
probably sooner. And to win that election, Ford needs 40% of the vote. So basically, anything, to a rough approximation, anything he does that, first of all, his base likes, but more than 40% of the voting base likes, is a win for him. Like if this is popular with 45, 50, 60% of the voting population, that's a net win for him.
That's interesting, like the way the distinction you're making there, the voting population, because voter turnout is so low that I'm like 40% of the voters in the last election is what, like 19%, I think, of the actual population of Ontario. And it's so frustrating watching him kind of being like, well, okay, young people, you're not going to get homes and you can't really afford a car. A lot of you, some people can, but like a lot of people can't afford a car. But like, we're not going to give you other options. We're just like, things that would make your life easier, we're just not going to do that for you. But that's okay because you guys don't vote, and most people who do vote will like this because like they don't want change. They're happy to have their property values go up. They have a home, they're totally fine, and they don't want to see bike lanes. They don't want to see it slow down. So it just feels like really just throwing people under the bus, especially like Gen Z. I can't imagine how I would feel starting out in my 20s and feeling like they just don't care at all about you.
Well, yeah, and I think overall, if you look at it, okay, like who is this popular with? It's popular with suburban voters in the 905, and even suburban voters in the 416, places like Etobicoke, where he is a member of provincial parliament. Those people are more likely to vote, and those are swing ridings in the elections, right? Where it's like, okay, the folks in Toronto Center might be upset about this. It's like, well who cares? Like, if you're like, Toronto Center is never going to elect a conservative, and even if they do, like, the Conservatives don't need that seat. They would have won everything by then. So I think that's the key point in all of this, is that it helps him with people that he needs their vote. And the people who don't like this, either he doesn't need their vote or they don't vote in the first place. So the math here is really, really key for him. And I find that progressives, like on social media and stuff, like really start to play like 40 chess on this, like come up with like really complicated explanations of why would a government do something like this, when the answer is it's popular, right? And it's popular with the people that you want their vote, and the people who don't like it, either they were never going to vote for you anyway. So who cares? So I don't think it's actually any more kind of complicated on this. But let's pivot a little bit from the politics, and actually talk about the evidence here with some kind of rigor and clarity. So again, you live in Toronto. You know these bike lanes better than I do. How much are these bike lanes actually impeding drivers? Has the city of Toronto looked at this at all?
Yeah, they have. And the data from the city of Toronto, like, to me, it's not as fulsome as I would like, but that's what we have from the city, so we can go with it. But also, there's plenty of studies from around the world, so we don't actually just have to look at Toronto. We're not the first place to do this. But let's look at the data here. Most recent is on the Bloor West bike lanes. Those are the ones that kind of go through into Ford's area. Those are streets he drives on, and those are the ones he seems to be really hating. Travel times did go up on this stretch during rush hour, but that's only between about 90 seconds and 3.5 minutes. But this also coincided with when the city decreased the speed limit by 20% in that area. It's been doing that across the city. So where main streets largely went down to around 40 kilometers an hour and residential down to 30 kilometers an hour. So the fact that those kind of came in around the same time in that area makes me go, okay, well, I don't know how much, when you look at vehicle speeds, like, would the lower speed limits have made a difference? Maybe with enforcement, who knows? The measurements compare also 2022 to 2023, and then comparing that to 2023, 2024. We know a lot more people went back to offices and started commuting more in the past year compared to in 2022. We've seen it in the news. We've talked about it on this podcast. We can also look at the data from the Bloor lanes that were implemented pre-pandemic, which is probably more useful to us because like that was such a drastic change in people's habits that I don't know that how much we can take from it. So at first, along Bloor Street, where they implemented it before, more centrally, travel times did increase. But then the city adjusted traffic signals, and those increases became very minimal. But again, we aren't the first place to do this. We can look at other countries. We can look at cities like Paris. We can look at New York, where they have seen minimal impact. And in Paris, it was even a decrease in travel times when safe bike infrastructure came in because they saw a decrease in the number of cars for the first time. There's also a lot of data that shows that more lanes for cars don't actually work. Like, they typically, people think, oh, just yeah, another lane, we'll be fine, we'll have more room to go. And that happens at first. And then more people start to drive on them as they're like, oh, that's a good route. And then they fill up. And more people will start driving because they're like, well, it becomes easy to drive around here. It does actually bring people there. And the same thing happens with bike lanes. It's the whole like, if you build it, they will come, as people start to feel safe with these alternatives to cars, meaning there's like fewer cars on the road, which then free up space for those who actually have to drive. So many people have said, well, what about those people like who are laborers who don't have a choice that they have to drive in the city? They can't bike. Like, you're not even thinking about them. And I'm like, I am thinking about them. I want the people who don't have to drive to have a safe alternative so that people who do have to have a smooth commute. Like, I don't get it. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, no, I get that as well when I kind of advocate for bike lanes, because the people are like, well, I wouldn't use a bike lane, so how does it help me? And I'm like, well, what it does is it gets me off the road, and I'm the guy slowing you down, right? So you have to understand that, we're all traffic, and yes, you might not use the bike lane, but you benefit from me using the bike lane and not taking my SUV.
Yeah, and I want to add that there's a lot of people criticizing it, saying that emergency vehicles are really impacted. I know that Doug Ford has specifically talked about University Avenue having a problem with the ambulances getting to hospitals. Emergency services in Toronto have repeatedly talked about how it has not made a difference, and so I really hate that that's still a talking point, and I get why, because it feels like that's true. You're like, how do they get around them? But they've figured it out. It works fine. People can still move over a bit and give them room to pass. And if the people who are actually responding to those emergency calls, if the paramedics are saying this isn't making a difference, then I don't know why people keep going back to, yes, it is. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it does seem to be this catch-all thing in many of the domains that you and I deal with. That comes up a lot with the single egress stairway thing, where it's like, oh, well, you can't do that because of firefighters. So yeah, that does come up again and again. And even when these organizations say, no, actually that's fine, we can we can work with this change. So if it's not the bike lanes that are primarily responsible for the Toronto's traffic chaos, which again is real and it exists, then why is there so much traffic congestion in the city of Toronto?
Honestly, I think it's just too many cars. There's something like a million more people in Ontario compared to before the pandemic. So things have gotten a lot worse in terms of number of people who are actually just within Ontario. And obviously, a lot of those ended up in the GTA, coming into Toronto for different things, whether it's their job or anything else, because there's so much available within the city that isn't available in a lot of other places. And so when you're increasing the population so quickly and not creating homes for people near the places they either need to be or want to be, then they have to rely on driving pretty much. Like, a lot of people end up in areas where they have to drive into the city because even the trains are not quite there that you can actually rely on them to get you there and back at the times you actually want to do it. And I've heard many times that the only solution for congestion is fewer cars. And I think that's really true. And there are specific things the cities can actually do to improve it, or really that the province can do. There's not a lot of coordination for construction across the city. You'd hope there'd be some way that they could compress the closures and get the work done all at once, because you see the same parts get closing down for different projects over and over. And I know that there are councillors who have talked about that, about how we need to have some more coordination between these different projects. And then also, of course, there's the big transit projects that the province should really be focusing on getting them off the ground, because like everything's so delayed. And as long as we don't have other alternatives, like I expect that a lot of people plan to take the Eglinton Crosstown when it opens. No one knows if it's going to open in the next year. Like, we have no idea. Who knows when the Ontario line will be open? I'm not convinced it'll be in the next 10 years. If they can focus on actually making these projects happen at a reasonable speed, I think we'll actually see a decrease in congestion then, when people have other options that are actually like get them there in reasonable times. What do you think? Like, what are some of those ideas that you have on how we can address congestion?
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of things we can do. One of the things to me is it's absolutely bananas to me that we're seeing so many mayors and politicians, advocate going back to the office. Work from home is, one of the best ways to particularly stop rush hour traffic, right? If more of us can just stay home and work, that really eases the pressure off of municipal infrastructure. Better transit, obviously, as you mentioned, mentioned coordinating construction and just getting better at construction, because that's a lot of it. In Again, I can't really speak to Toronto as much, but here in the city of Ottawa, a lot of the issues we're having with traffic is just that we have these construction projects. They're not well coordinated. They go over schedule, and they just don't work as well as they could. One of the big ones I want to talk about is on street parking, and a little anecdote or a little case study here. I live in the Glebe, as many of you know, and I live near Bank Street in Ottawa. And Bank Street in the Glebe is our major kind of north-south artery for those of you who don't know Ottawa. And it's 4 lanes in the section that I live in. And first of all, there's no turning lane. So if a car wants to turn left, like everything just backs up. And I should also point out there's no bike lanes. So 4 lanes of traffic, but no turning lanes. So anybody who wants to turn left, everything just grinds to a standstill. But as well, like 2 of those lanes are constantly used as on-street parking at all times of the day. And often I'll hear people go, well, you can solve that by not having that during rush hour. But there's a lot of traffic on, not on rush hour, particularly here in the Glebe. Like we have the Ottawa 67s, we have the Red Blacks. Any one of those games, traffic just comes to a standstill because it's only 2 lanes instead of 4. So this is a big issue. If we could just eliminate that on-street parking, get people to park on side streets, get them, we built some parking facilities here in the Glebe, you would double traffic. And in fact, one of the things I've advocated for is you could actually probably knock it down to 3 lanes, have one of them be a turning lane, 2 other lanes going in the opposite direction. That actually give you room for a bike lane. So like we can have our cake and eat it too here, where we can have a bike lane, we can create a turning lane, and we could actually get traffic flowing. Now, it's interesting. The Canadian Automobile Association has a great resource on ways that municipalities can address congestion. We'll add to it in the show notes. I really like it because it's a very accessible read. It has like 8 different ideas of what municipalities can do. But ironically, in this conversation, one of the things they argue for is bicycling infrastructure. The CAA itself said that bicycling infrastructure can be a way to actually reduce congestion because you get people in their bikes, you kind of reduce that traffic. So there are solutions there, but I think the grand irony in all this is when the Canadian Automobile Association is saying, yeah, you know what, bicycling infrastructure can help solve traffic. I think we should be listening to that.
And I know that there's a lot of politicians who talk about how we just don't put them on main streets. I'm not against bike lanes. I just want them on side streets. I hear that all the time. And I've heard that from this government. And for those people who are thinking that, please pull up a map of Toronto. I'll link to one. There was a great tweet where someone tried to show exactly along Yonge Street, for example. Those neighborhoods around Yonge Street, they were specifically built to keep traffic out of their neighborhoods. They do not want people coming there. That's why there aren't that many cars going through there. There's no through lanes you can go. So like if you wanted to do it, you just basically are doing like a zigzag back and forth over and over trying to get through. So no one's going to do that. There's no way to do it. The only alternatives, like the next north-south street that you can actually take along Yonge Street is Mount Pleasant and Avenue, 2 busy streets that people will be just as miserable about bike lanes being on. And then Other Urbanity has a great video we'll link to where they looked at the Bloor West lanes and why you can't, there's not just one side street you can take. You wouldn't be able to go anywhere near Bloor Street and still like have anything that's a reasonable route that doesn't take you several kilometers out of your way, which remember when you're on a bike, it's not like in a car. If you're going several kilometers out of the way, you're very tired and you're just not going to do that. So I think that's something to remember. Like actually look at the maps and try to point out a route. Like it's a great challenge that you probably cannot complete. If Doug Ford actually goes ahead with ripping out these bike lanes, and then I don't think traffic is going to improve at all. But how long do you think it'll take for people to actually realize that?
Yeah, well, sadly, this is going to take a while. So it would be after whenever the next election is. It sounds like the next election is coming soon. Based on the $200 that we're all getting as part of the fall economic statement. So yeah, overall, I don't think I don't think we're going to realize that this is a non-solution until after the next election.
Last point I want to talk about is if someone cares a lot about this, I wonder what they can do, because there's a lot of people right now. There's some protests happening at Queen's Park trying to tell Doug Ford we don't want this. I don't think that that's making a difference, in that he's not going to change his mind. I don't think it's possible that if enough people showed up. But I think right now what I hear from a lot of the boomers in my life is, oh, look at those people, they're just complaining, like, oh, isn't that feels kind of great, we're pissing off the right people. And I don't know what they're supposed to do, because it doesn't seem like there's any hope right now, because you have like a mayor who is advocating for these bike lanes, but like, if you're just, a young person living in Ontario and you want a home and safe ways to get around, what can you actually do to make change happen?
Yeah, well, I'd say first of all, like I actually think protest is very valuable, and actually with this government as well, we've seen this government back off on any number of things, from changes to the Ontario Autism Program to I remember during the pandemic where they were going to close all of the playgrounds for kids, and the premier backed off of that within like 24 hours. So I actually think these protests can be helpful. But I think the challenge is they only work if you can get a large enough size of the population on board. And in fact, if 60, 70, 80% of the population's on board with the Ford government, then in fact they can actually be counterproductive, right? Because they actually highlight an issue that's popular with the general public and actually can make Ford more popular. So I think a lot of it starts with actually working to convince the general public, right? It's which is tough work. Obviously voting is a big one, particularly if you are someone who likes these bike lanes and don't necessarily live in kind of Toronto center. So if you're a young person living in the suburbs, like, your vote is really important here.
And yet, because it's so popular, the opposition parties have not been quite very loud about it. I was surprised at how not loud about it some of the opposition parties have been, even though they could take up this issue. But I think they also know how popular it is.
Yeah, no, I think so as well. I think so as well. But there, that creates space for a variety of different groups to highlight the sort of downsides of this, try and build public support. Talk about some of the issues where. I go back to the issue of beer in convenience stores, right? Which is a thing that, I think most Ontarians like, but what they didn't like was the fact that it cost taxpayers so much money. And I think that might be one of the things that advocates could focus on here, going, like, we built all this bike lanes, and now you're going to rip them up at massive taxpayer expense. So that kind of waste of funds arguments can help. But yeah, I think it's understanding that this is going to be a grind. But you have to do what you can do and vote. And I actually think particularly vote in municipal elections. And I know here's a case where Ford is overriding municipality, but that tends to be the exception, not the rule. Municipal elections tend to have very low turnout. They tend to be very close and can be swayed by a handful of voters. So I really use your voice, use your votes, and get out there and try and win hearts and minds. I think that's all you can really do.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about bike lanes or the opinions of middle-aged white men, please send us an email at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.